Okay, it's 3 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Model L, Using LLCs and Fiscal Sponsorship. My name is Sandy Pond, and I am a Foundation Center librarian and one of the editors of GrantSpace, the center's website where nonprofits can find answers, tools, and resources on grant seeking, fundraising, and management. First, I'd like to give you a quick tour of your webinar screen. In the upper left corner of your screen, you can download 3 files: slides for Steven Dini's main presentation on Model L, the 2011 article about Model L, written by today's presenters, that's the largest file, and slides from today's introduction and wrap-up. Also on the left is the Q&A box. There you can type and send questions to our guest presenters, which they will answer during the last half of today's webinar. If you're having technical issues, also use that same Q&A box to send questions. My colleague, Sarah Jo Neubauer, is helping us today, so don't be alarmed if you see responses from her or me. Now, I suspect that some of you joining us today are new to Foundation Center and our work. Foundation Center is a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the U.S. and around the world. One way we accomplish our mission is through educating thousands of people each year through a full curriculum of training courses in the classroom and online. We offer free and affordable classes nationwide about the funding research process, proposal writing, grant makers and their giving, and related nonprofit management topics, like today's session on fiscal sponsorship. Later on, if you'd like to learn more about fiscal sponsorship or other nonprofit-related topics, please visit GrantSpace. Nearly all of the content there is free to use. So first off, we'd like to ask our audience a few questions so we can get a sense of who's with us today and where you're coming from. So here are a few poll questions. Okay, so go ahead and click on the category that best describes you. Okay, it looks like we have a good number of fiscal sponsors here today. All right. And then I have a couple more questions for you. Okay, so it looks like we have mostly domestic visitors today from both coasts. All right. And then one more question for you. Oops. Let's try. Okay. Let me try and make that a little bigger for you all. Okay. Great. All right, so it does look like that a good number of you have taken a glance at Steven and Gregory's article, which will be very helpful to understand today's content. So thank you very much for responding to all of those polls. Now, let me just get this out of the way. Okay, so now I hope you all will join me in welcoming today's guest presenters, Gregory Colvin and Steven Dini of Adler & Colvin. a San Francisco-based law firm that provides legal services and support to the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in the U.S. In 2011, Greg and Steven co-authored a journal article that introduced the Model L form of fiscal sponsorship. In addition, Greg is the author of Fiscal Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right, which is considered to be the authoritative text on the subject. Greg and Steven, thank you so much for joining us today. And lastly, here is how this hour will unfold. So, without further ado, Greg, would you like to take it away with some introductory remarks?
Sure. Can you hear my voice all right, everyone?
Very well.
Good, good. Well, it's been 20 years since I was commissioned by the San Francisco Foundation and the Garbodi Foundation to write the book, Fiscal Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right. And our host today, the Foundation Center, has always been a great resource to the field, to both grant makers and grant seekers alike. So great big thank you for all your support. You know, the concept of models with different degrees of liability, tax treatment, and administrative mechanics was important because there have always been several ways to do it right and probably dozens of ways to do it wrong. But what is it? What is fiscal sponsorship? Well, when a nonprofit corporation gets IRS recognition as a 501c3 public charity, it gains many advantages for its own operation, but can also confer some of those advantages on all sorts of projects that the sponsor might adopt. Now, these projects may not have legal or tax status of their own, but to further its tax-exempt purposes, the sponsor can essentially bring them in various ways under its umbrella. The book that we did arranges the models, the 6 models, from A to F in declining levels of liability. Model A, which is also referred to as a direct sponsorship or comprehensive or in-house sponsorship, is a relationship in which really the project is simply a department internal to the 501c3 public charity and handled no differently than any other direct activity. The other end of the scale of 6 would be Model F, which is essentially a back office operation in which the sponsor provides technical assistance for a fee for an organization that already does have its 501c3 public charity status. And you know, even from the beginning, there have always been other candidates to be models of fiscal sponsorship, and including one that was proposed but is no longer being used by the Mormon Church, a form of trust accounts, and custodial funds, which we see from time to time, in which the sponsor acts like a bank and never really owns the project assets. So in the last 20 years, fiscal sponsorship has really grown in respectability and professional sophistication, and there are now billions of charitable assets held in central fiscally sponsored operations that work regionally or nationwide, and they serve fields of endeavor from documentary film to public health, from arts to the environment, and they cover disaster relief and human services in the United States and overseas. And I might say this legitimacy has been supported by several central institutions such as the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors and the San Francisco Study Center, which published the book and also maintains a website called fiscalsponsordirectory.org. I might say that fiscal sponsorship is also a well-known means for incubating new public charities before they get their IRS recognition letter. And I would say, based on our own experience in our law practice, more than half the time an organization that applies for its own 501c3 status will go through an initial period of incubation under the umbrella of a fiscal sponsor. I would also say that part of the professional management of fiscally sponsored organizations include what has become a more or less standard lexicon of terms, so that as much as possible we don't hear people referring to this relationship as fiscal agency or fiscal agents, but are moving toward a more correct term of fiscal sponsors. And more I see the models referred to by their letters, which are arbitrary, of course, but they do allow people to converse about fiscal sponsorship and be clear when they're talking about the same thing and when they're talking about something different. Well, as our webinar is about to illustrate, models A and C, and model C is a re-granting relationship to projects, are the most common. But now onto the stage has stepped a new model, we're calling it Model L, for a limited liability company or an LLC. Now this is not a corporation, but it can function as a wholly owned subsidiary of a 501c3 public charity, containing the project's liabilities, enjoying all the benefits of its 501c3 parent's tax status, but with virtually autonomous management. So for the subject in detail, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Steven Dini. Steven?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Steven Dini. I'm an attorney at Adler & Colvin in San Francisco, and I'll be presenting this morning's talk on the use of limited liability companies in fiscal sponsorship, or Model L, as Greg Colvin and I termed it in an article from a couple of years ago where we first explored the concept. So, why would you ever use an LLC in fiscal sponsorship? The LLC is, after all, usually thought of as a vehicle for doing for-profit business. With fiscal sponsorship, however, we found that setting up an LLC with the fiscal sponsor as the sole member can combine the advantages of the two current predominant models of fiscal sponsorship, Model A and Model C, while avoiding some of their pitfalls. Before delving into Model L, though, it's useful to review the attributes of Models A and C, as well as their relative advantages and disadvantages, since this is really how we started to perceive the value of the new Model L in fiscal sponsorship, and it also helps to bring the features of Model L into relief. Of these two primary existing models of fiscal sponsorship, Model A is the more straightforward one. In a Model A sponsorship, an outside project basically approaches the public charity that will serve as the fiscal sponsor. The charity agrees to set up a restricted fund on its books in which it will take in contributions and grants for the charitable purposes of the project. It may bring the key project personnel onto its staff. It may also form an advisor committee project leaders to oversee the project. The key attribute of Model A is that the fiscally sponsored project is no different from any other internal program of the sponsor or any other activity that the sponsor carries on directly. And here we have a basic overview of how a Model A fiscal sponsorship works, which, as you can see, is really quite simple. Funders and contributors write their checks directly to the public charity that serves as the fiscal sponsor. The project is basically an internal program of the sponsor, which provides administrative services for the project as it would for any other internal program. The fiscal sponsorship agreement with project leaders can provide for their oversight of the project as an advisory committee. Model A is not without its drawbacks, however. Since the project is legally no different from any other activity the sponsor carries on directly as an internal program, the sponsor in principle has unlimited liability for project activities. This can be scary for a sponsor if project leaders want to pursue an activity with a high degree of risk, such as anything involving children. One more drawback is the fact that it can be complicated to spin off a project to a new sponsor. When you go to transfer a Model A project, you're essentially talking about transferring an internal department. This involves not only transferring funds, but also possibly assigning contracts and moving employees, which can become time-consuming and expensive. Yet one more drawback is the status of the project committee. Since the project is an internal program of the sponsor, it can sometimes become difficult to put your finger on exactly what legal role the project committee performs, not to mention what legal rights it has vis-a-vis the sponsor, and close care needs to be taken in drafting the fiscal sponsorship agreement here. Model C is quite different from Model A. Under Model C, the project remains external to the sponsor. The project is conducted by outside individuals or by an outside entity, even a new nonprofit corporation that hasn't obtained its exemption yet. The sponsor and the project enter into a pre-approved grant relationship, where the sponsor reviews the prospective grantee, determines that the grantee is able to carry out the project it's proposing, and commits to take in funds for the charitable purposes of the project and makes disbursements to the grantee. And here in slide 7, we have an illustration of Model C, with the project now located outside the sponsor, and the sponsor making periodic disbursements to grantee and perhaps performing some back-office services. Note, however, that the fiscal sponsor itself is still the one taking the money in from grantors and contributors, and this can cause some cognitive dissonance for project leaders and for the funders, especially since the project here is more autonomous than in Model A. One advantage of Model C over Model A is the sponsor's limited liability. It generally has the same level of liability as an ordinary grantor. Also, it's easier to spin off a Model C project, whether to another fiscal sponsor or, say, to a new nonprofit corporation that has been running the project as the Model C grantee and has just received its 501c3 exemption. This makes Model C especially useful for incubating charities. Third, it's easier to conceive of the Model C relationship in legal terms. There are two separate parties entering into a contractual arrangement. Model C also has its own disadvantages, however. As Greg's book explains, if there's a trap for the unwary among fiscal sponsorship arrangements, Model C is it. It can be very tricky to set up the model in a way that properly preserves the sponsor's discretion and control over project funds and avoids earmarking contributions for the project grantee. Also, the sponsor naturally has less control over an outside project grantee than it would over an internal Model A project. There can also be administrative difficulties, and in the background there's the question of how the grantee should be reporting the funds it receives. As I mentioned above, the model can also lead to confusion among funders, since a Model C project is more independent and autonomous by nature, and there's usually a real entity with the project's name that's running the project. Model L is quite a different thing entirely. Here, the sponsor operates the project out of an LLC in which the sponsor is the sole member. The sponsor controls the LLC, but since LLCs can be run by managers instead of by the member itself, the sponsor can install the project personnel as a board of managers with fiduciary duties owed to the sponsor. An LLC, of course, combines the limited liability of a corporation under state law with pass-through treatment for federal income tax purposes. A single-member LLC is disregarded as separate from its sole member for federal tax purposes, and its income and activities are treated as those of the sole member. Here in slide 12, we have diagrams of the three models side by side, and the thing you should immediately recognize is that in Model L, the outside funders are interacting directly with the project entity, whereas in the Model A and Model C structures, they're writing checks to the fiscal sponsor. This diagram also illustrates the relative autonomy of the Model L project. Although the sponsor is the sole member and has ultimate control over the LLC, the Model L project is separate and, at least in this diagram, is run by the project leaders as the LLC managers. Two critical developments made LLCs really a viable option for use in fiscal sponsorship under this sort of structure. First, in Information Letter 2010-52, the IRS clarified that where a private foundation makes a grant to a disregarded LLC whose sole member is a public charity, The foundation can generally treat the grant as a qualifying distribution and won't need to conduct expenditure responsibility. Second, in Notice 2012-52, the IRS explained that contributions made to these LLCs are eligible for a charitable deduction. With a Model L fiscal sponsorship, the activities and income of the LLC are attributed directly to the fiscal sponsor charity itself. The project is treated as an internal division of the sponsor, as would be the case with the Model A project. Differently from Models A and C, however, the funders and contributors cultivated by the project leaders can make grants and contributions directly to the project LLC. One caveat here, when we say federal tax treatment of LLCs, we're generally talking about federal income tax. If the LLC itself will have its own employees, the LLC will not be disregarded for federal employment tax purposes. For federal income tax purposes, Model L is a lot more like Model A. For state corporate law purposes, however, it's much more like Model C in that the project is conducted from an entity outside the fiscal sponsor. In Model L, the sponsor-project relationship is much closer, as their parent and subsidiary, rather than grantor and grantee. In principle, the fiscal sponsor has limited liability for project activities. I say in principle because, as we know, the veil of limited liability is not impermeable. Moving now to the mechanics of how Model L works, we envisioned that there were few ways to duplicate what a fiscal sponsorship agreement would otherwise do in a Model A or Model C arrangement, where the agreement would not only define the structure of the arrangement, but also spell out the sponsorship fees, the services to be provided to the project by the sponsor, and so forth. In the LLC context, the operating agreement would set up a manager structure, spell out the duties owed by the managers to the sole member, provide for periodic reporting to the member, and even address how a transfer of the membership interest to a new fiscal sponsor would be approached. One important issue is how to pay the sponsorship fee to the parent. In Models A or C, funding would be received from the outside by the sponsor itself, and the sponsor would then pay itself the agreed-upon fee out of the project fund. Model L is a little more tricky, and there are several ways to approach the issue. One of the more straightforward approaches, we think, is to have an administrative services agreement or a resource sharing agreement between the project LLC and the sponsor that provides for the payment of a fee to the sponsor and a reimbursement of the project's pro rata expenses. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Model L combines many of the qualities of Model A and Model C while avoiding some of their pitfalls. Compared to Model A, a chief advantage of the Model L arrangement is that the sponsor in principle has limited liability. Moreover, depending on where the LLC is formed, the project itself can also be somewhat protected from the sponsor's own creditors, since in some states the creditor of an LLC member can get at the member's economic interest in the LLC, such as its right to receive distributions, but can't get the actual membership interest itself, meaning in theory that a creditor can't vote the interest or cause the LLC to dissolve and distribute its assets upstream as it would be able to do in a corporate setting. This very much depends on where the LLC was formed, however, as well as where the parent and the LLC find itself in court. From the perspective of project leaders, Model L has other advantages over Model A. For example, if project leaders are installed as the LLC's managers, they'll have more practical control over the project's money, perhaps to a greater extent than would be the case even with Model C. It's easier to transfer the project than in Model A. The fiscal sponsor just assigns its LLC membership interest to a new sponsor. Also, the project has a fundamentally separate identity from the sponsor and can go out and solicit funding in its own name. Turning to slide 19, with a contrast against Model C, the project leaders in a Model L will typically run the project on a day-to-day basis, but the fiscal sponsor has complete legal control over the LLC. As its sole member, The sponsor can remove the managers, amend the operating agreement, or dissolve the LLC entirely. In a Model C arrangement, the sponsor holds the project purse strings and it can stop the funding stream, but it would generally have no direct legal control over the grantee itself. Furthermore, in Model L, there's not really a need to worry about how the project LLC should be treating its income for tax purposes, since the LLC is disregarded as separate from the sponsor. Also, there should be less of a concern about vendor confusion. In Model C projects, a fiscal sponsor can sometimes find itself paying project vendors directly out of the restricted fund, with the sponsor's name on the check, whereas in a Model L project, the LLC just pays its own bills directly from its own bank account, with the funding it receives directly from grantors and contributors. There are, of course, a number of caveats with Model L. The first thing is the issue of startup costs. The LLC needs to be formed, and the operating agreement needs to be worked out, possibly with an administrative services agreement as well. Also, as I mentioned, the corporate veil between the parent sponsor and the project LLC is not impermeable, and the parties need to be careful about setting things up and running the LLC in a way that doesn't turn it into the alter ego of the sponsor. Conversely, because of the autonomy that Model L permits, combined with the fact that the LLC is disregarded as separate from the sponsor for federal tax purposes, the sponsor needs to be vigilant in monitoring the activity of the managers. A big hurdle to Model L, at least in California, and at least for the moment, is that the LLC is not exempt from the California franchise tax or the annual LLC fee, even though it's wholly owned by a charity. In addition, as I alluded before, the LLC has fundamental connotations of for-profit business, and in fact, some of the interest we've seen in Model L has come from people who think it's meant for business ventures with outside investors, when in fact the fiscal sponsorship setting restricts this concept to purely charitable purposes. So, some final thoughts on Model L. We think there's a chance that Model L could become the dominant model where risk management is a big concern, or at least enough of a concern that it would outweigh the cost and effort of establishing a Model L structure. Of course, even wider use may be possible if the issue of state and local taxes could be resolved. In more ordinary cases, though, we think that Models A and C are relatively simple and straightforward, and they may remain the preferred choices. For more background on this concept, I'd refer you to one of the handouts for our presentation, which is the article where Greg and I originally fleshed out Model L. It's called The Use of LLCs in Fiscal Sponsorship, a New Model.
I did ask early on about samples of Model L fiscal sponsorship agreements or LLC operating agreements. So, Greg or Steven, can you respond to that question?
Sure. Well, at this stage of development, while we have prepared formation documents and operating agreements for our clients who are starting to use Model L as a standard agreement that they can use for multiple projects, we haven't yet developed a sample that would somehow be workable as a national exemplar. And it's going to be difficult to get to that point because depending on the state in which you form the LLC, the documents may look differently. And we've done work in Delaware, but we know that in California we would have to structure the LLC operating agreement somewhat differently. Plus, as I think many of you may know, if you're familiar with fiscal sponsorship agreements and the policies and procedures that may go with them when you're running a sponsorship program, there are a lot of specific kinds of administration that are unique to each sponsor's way of doing things. So it may be that down the road in some months or years we'll have a a sample, maybe based on Delaware, but at this point, we don't yet have it.
Okay, thanks. And are there, as they do these formation documents, are there special fiscal sponsorship clauses or separate agreements that need to be included to give it some sort of distinction that it is a fiscal sponsorship project?
Well, not in the LLC formation document that's filed with the state in which it's established. That's usually a one-page, very plain vanilla document. It's much less detailed than the Articles of Incorporation that I'm sure you all are familiar with. There's no need to state charitable purposes or the restrictions that are needed to qualify under 501c3 for charitable support. It's basically just notifying the state and the public at large that a enterprise operating under a certain name under the law of Delaware, or New York, or California has been formed and indicate who it is that's formed it. Now, when you get to the operating agreement, this is where it gets more complicated, and certainly I can imagine that there would be a number of sort of generic fiscal sponsorship restrictions and purposes and ways of doing things that might be different from an LLC operating, let's say, as a business in the high-tech sector or in some other for-profit realm. So, sure, I think the answer would be no, nothing specific to fiscal sponsorship in the state-filed documents by the LLC, but probably quite a bit in the operating agreement that essentially enables a manager or a board of managers to run the project.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Brian asked, nonprofits are generally exempt from securities registration. Can Model L's LLC issue bonds, debentures, or certificates of participation that are also exempt from securities registration?
Well, we certainly have an advanced audience in certain respects. To ask that kind of question indicates, a lot of sophistication in what LLCs might be able to do in the for-profit world. But we're just starting with the initial steps to see how Model L, the LLCs, might function in the charitable world. And it's pretty clear that one of the basic structural requirements is that it be a single-member LLC, not a multiple-member LLC. So the possibility of having some kind of ownership participation by others besides the charity is really not on the table here. We're talking about a wholly owned single-member LLC. Now, how it raises its money, whether it exists strictly on contributions or whether it has loans or program-related investments, and whether it might pursue some form of agreement with funding sources that had the character of a security, that's really far down the road, and it's not part of what we're trying to build at the present moment.
Okay, thank you. All right, since this is liability risk is a big element here, so Tivoni asked kind of a follow-up question. What kind of insurance is needed for the LLC? Is it covered by the sponsor, by the sponsor's D&O? Can you answer that?
Sure.
Did you hear that question?
Yes, I did.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. We've had a number of very intense conversations about insurance coverage, general liability, directors and officers, special liability for non-owned auto coverage and so on, employment issues coverage. And we've had some of these conversations in particular with NIAC and ANI, which is a insurance operation devoted to serving the nonprofit sector based in California. And it appears from those conversations, one was at the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors meeting in November, that insurance carriers are getting increasingly sophisticated with how fiscal sponsors operate with multiple projects. And it could very well be that the easiest sort of way to segue from the fiscal sponsor's own insurance to the LLC's insurance is to simply add them as an additional insured on the main policy and go through the process with the broker of determining exactly what the shape of that policy and its additional endorsements and amendments might need to be, depending on what property the LLC owns, what its employees are doing, and what kind of exposures might result from interaction with clients, patients, the public, etc. It is also possible that the LLC could have its own completely separate insurance policy, completely separate broker, and arrive at suitable insurance policies in that fashion. So it could be done either way.
Okay. All right. Now, taking it in a slightly different direction, Tarsha asked, if I already have an established LLC, is it possible to transfer it to a fiscal sponsor, or does the fiscal sponsor need to create the LLC?
No, the fiscal sponsor doesn't need to create it. It could be transferred so long as at the end of the transfer the fiscal sponsor is the single member, which has ultimate control and power over the existence of the LLC.
Okay. All right. And Karen asked, can you provide us with an example of someone currently practicing Model L?
Well, we have done it for various clients of ours who are just beginning to roll them out as a service. I'm not at liberty at this point to identify them, although actually it's quite possible that one or more of them may be on this call and may be willing to, you could use the Q&A box to do that. Let us know that you're out there providing this service. So at this point, I don't have a particular operator of the Model L to hold up for people to contact, but perhaps we'll begin the conversation in this way today.
Okay, fair enough. But can you give some examples of, just generally speaking, without identifying specific names, Model L fiscal sponsorship projects that have been set up and now are in progress, for the fields that they're in, and a general description of what the project is?
Well, sure. One of the areas in which I'm most familiar with the use of Model L is in the arts, where there are regional or national fiscal sponsors that support a number of projects that could be in the visual arts, it could be in the fine arts, could be music, could be all sorts of things where, ordinarily what you see is a small group or an individual develops a project, and they actually create ordinarily a Model C relationship. That's a re-grant relationship with the fiscal sponsor where grants and deductible contributions can come to the fiscal sponsor earmarked for the purposes of the arts project and then be re-granted periodically to the artist or to the artistic group in order to perform the artistic endeavor. Well, that does leave a lot of the burden of administering the project on the artistic group, because they essentially have to file tax returns and have their own insurance and do all of this that in the case of Model A would be done as a back office service by the fiscal sponsor. So I'm aware of at least one situation where a fiscal sponsor that focuses on arts and culture has begun to offer Model L as an alternative for those projects that want more back office support to be performed at the central level, but still want to have the sort of separate bank account and ability to manage autonomously the details of the project. So although, it's interesting, I think our original concept was that Model A fiscal sponsors would gravitate toward using Model L as a way of limiting liability and sort of offloading some of the work of managing a Model A direct project. In fact, we've seen some development of the use of Model L in the opposite direction, where what might have been a Model C re-grant project is actually moving toward a closer relationship with its sponsor and more intense infrastructure by use of the Model L setup.
Now, Jan asked a question about, accounting. If the LLC received funds to its own bank account, how does the 501c3 receipt those donations?
Well, the IRS treats the sole member LLC as a disregarded entity. And so when it comes to providing a receipt, the receipt would come from the fiscal sponsor in the fiscal sponsor's name. What's interesting, if not a bit sort of counterintuitive, is that on the solicitation end, we've gotten clear signals from the IRS that the Model L project can receive those donations in its own name because it is, for tax purposes, considered a disregarded entity. And actually, I want to anticipate perhaps another question, which is, one of the great benefits of fiscal sponsorship under Model A or Model C is that you're able to use the official recognition of the sponsor as a way of assuring the donor that they have a tax-deductible donation that they're making, or the foundation is making a grant that is to a recognized IRS public charity. Even though it is completely legal now to make a deductible contribution or a grant directly to the LLC in its own name, some might wonder, well, how can I confirm that that name is a name that will entitle me to the charitable deduction? What we're recommending these days, and there may be a further registration system that would develop over time, but there is a form, an IRS Form 8832, by which the LLC can register with the IRS and indicate its sole member relationship with the parent 501c3 public charity. So even though this is not a letter coming back from the IRS saying this LLC is a suitable recipient for deductible contributions, nevertheless it's an official form that can be filed by the LLC itself and made public as a documentation of the relationship to support receiving checks in the name of the LLC. But at this point, it appears to us that the LLC would not issue its own receipts in its own name to donors. That would still be done by the public charity of which it is a part.
Okay. So it still is definitely in the project's best interest to show a clear connection with the sponsoring organization, correct? Is that what I understood?
Well, that's right, and it will also, and it must be very clear about this, all of the operations, all the assets, liabilities, income, and expenses of the Model L, single member LLC will show up integrated into the parent organization's Form 990. And of course, if it's a substantial area of project activity, it'll show up as one of the principal accomplishments and program areas of the sponsor, even though it's being managed by a separate LLC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. All right, and Jen had a follow-up question to this: is whose tax ID is used for solicitation, state by state, day by day? Would it be the LLC, the project, or the main sponsor?
Well, there's two ways to do it. One is to use the main sponsor's tax ID number throughout. And on the other hand, it is certainly acceptable for the LLC to get its own tax ID number and also to file its own payroll tax returns and so on. Now, when the Form 990 is filed, all of that gets integrated into the parent's Form 990 with its the parent's EIN number, and there may be some variations from state to state. As you know, many of the states have their own income tax system and their own tax exemption system, and may require a separate EIN for the LLC. So that's going to have to be worked out sort of state by state. But at this point, probably it would either be use the parent's EIN number or use the LLC's separate EIN number, but with some indication of its relationship with the sponsor.
Okay, thank you. All right, Priya has a question. Where did it just go? Sorry. Okay, will the LLC be exempt from state sales tax, property tax, etc.?
Yeah, well, we've looked into this a bit in California. For property tax, yes. With the proper language in the formation documents, an LLC, which is sponsored by a California public charity, will be able to have the equivalent under the welfare or other exemptions provided in California. Under the sales tax regime in California, it doesn't work quite so well unless there's a specific activities exception, but of course that's true for the parents as well. In California, we have a very elaborate system. If you sell hot dogs at a Little League game, it's exempt from sales tax, but you know, if you move to running a museum store, it might not be, at least for all the items. So that question of sales tax really is a question of what bracket the service or product falls into.
Okay, thanks. All right, and actually this is an earlier question also from Priya. It seems like this Model L approach is more likely to be initiated by a sponsor who wants to insure against certain activities rather than by a project looking for a sponsor. Is she understanding that correctly?
Well, I would have expected that to occur, but you know, oftentimes the question of whether certain activities are just too hot to handle in a Model A structure doesn't come up until you have somebody coming in to the sponsor saying what they want to do is run a kayaking program on the Colorado River for children under 12, and the possibility of liability extending beyond the assets of that project presents itself, and so that's where really there could be a mutual interest by both the project and the sponsor in a sort of limited liability alternative.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. All right, and Leroy asked, I'm not clear if an existing 501c3 could use Model L to start a new project that is related to the overall mission, but distinct from the currently existing projects and activities.
Oh, by all means it could. I mean, the one thing it does have to do, if it's going to enjoy the benefit of the parent's 501c3 exemption, is have a good congruity of mission. That is, that the mission of the LLC fits within the overall mission of the sponsor. But that's always true, no matter what kind of sponsorship you're using. But no, it's entirely new kind of activity that the sponsor hasn't had under its wing before the moment that it comes in.
Okay, thank you. All right, now a small but growing part of our audience is based in other countries. What implications, if any, does Model L have for international projects that wish to do direct fundraising?
Well, it depends on how it's set up. You have to keep in mind that the Model L concept is really limited to a United States 501c3 public charity that wholly owns the LLC. If there is a foreign charity that is practicing fiscal sponsorship, and we have seen it in Canada and elsewhere, that sets up an LLC subsidiary in the United States, it wouldn't be able to realize the same advantages in terms of deductible donations and grants. And for that situation, the LLC has the same advantages as it would to any other use of an LLC, no double taxation and the limited liability. On the other hand, if the public charity is based in the United States and wants to conduct charitable projects overseas, well, they could use a Delaware or other LLC that's based in this country and just simply manage the funds here for a project that actually functions in Africa or Asia or some other part of the world. I guess the most interesting iteration of this might be if the LLC or some other legal formation is created under the laws not of the United States but of another country. It could be Britain, could be France, it could be India. And then, you know, we really don't know whether the IRS would recognize the formation of the LLC or the corporate entity as a subsidiary functioning under the laws of another country as a disregarded entity for tax purposes and get the same benefit under federal tax law that we would be able to recognize in the United States. So I'd love to have that question. That sounds like it'd be very interesting to, if it were worthwhile, if there was sufficient assets to make it a viable alternative to see if an LLC in another country or an LLP, limited liability partnership, would work under U.S. tax law.
Okay. Now you mentioned, having enough assets, and that was something in your article that, smaller projects that aren't well funded probably are not good candidates for this Model L form. So what are some examples or traits of projects that would be good candidates for this? And what are the key element that should be in a project before it considers Model L?
Well, I think first of all it has to have a sizable enough budget to be able to fund some of the additional work that's needed structurally. That is, to create the LLC, to set up the operating agreement for it. And even though the compliance with federal tax law might be fairly easy, requiring a filing of its own employer ID number and filing its own payroll tax returns, the greater administrative burden probably will come into play in the states in which it's operating and in the tax-exempt systems that may or may not in California or Arizona or any other state be quite so conducive to the use of the LLC. So you're still getting, though, something that could be extremely important, which is the limitation of liability and the protection of the other assets of the sponsor. So with sufficient assets at risk or invested in the LLC and other assets of the sponsor protect, you could reach a critical mass where it really ought to be considered. I guess the other thing that we see is that we know from seeing a lot of fiscally sponsored projects that there are higher risks with the vulnerable populations, whether it's underage children or whether it's seniors, disabled people. There are greater liabilities associated with outdoor or athletic activities. And one area in which I would expect to see more LLC formation in fiscal sponsorship is where there's actually ownership of property. It could be a nature conservancy, it could be a building which is used to house a charitable project. It could be a documentary film where there is some sort of tangible product that, in a more traditional sense, could be protected by being contained within the LLC and have the sole member of that LLC be the charity, but not be the direct owner of the assets. It could also be useful where there's a greater distance between the sponsor and the project locations, and where the managers of the project really want to run their own bank account, but not do it as a separate taxable entity, do it within the tax-exempt umbrella of the sponsor. So I would say that aside from the issues of size and vulnerability of the project to risk, I think the most interesting development is going to be sort of the allocation of autonomous management features that are desired by projects that are not coming to the sponsor to have the sponsor take over the whole back office, but actually want to be hands-on with respect to disbursement of funds and solicitation of funds.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And we're just 2 minutes before the hour, so I'm going to do a very quick wrap-up here. Thank you, Greg and Steven, so much for taking time from your busy schedules today to share your expertise with all of us. And Greg and Steven have kindly shared their contact information here, so I know that we didn't get to a few of your questions, so feel free to reach out to them separately to ask your questions. And I hope you'll all give a huge thank you to Greg and Steven virtually through the Q&A box by posting your comments there, because they can see what you post. And so to our audience, I have one last poll for you here. Let's see, and here we go. Okay. And I hope you can see that. Okay, well, it looks like that people found today very useful, and I'm very, very glad to hear that. And as I stated earlier, we will be recording this webinar, or we are recording it right now, and so it should be posted onto GrantSpace by the end of this week, so by the end of Friday. And since you registered, we have your email addresses, so we will also send you the direct link. And then if you have a few more minutes to spare, we'd appreciate it very much if you would click on that orange bit.ly link there and complete a short survey to give us a bit of feedback about your experience today. And then last but not least, and I'll come back to this link in just a moment, we've got another webinar tomorrow as well as next week about fundraising and getting your board engaged. So you can click on those links as well, or visit our online events calendar for more information about these events. So thank you all again for attending today's webinar on Model L fiscal sponsorship. And we hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.